Good afternoon. Preservation of media art does not simply require care for the material endurance of the artifact anymore. Preservation of time-based technologies itself must be processual as an ongoing act of updating the analog or digital artwork. Still, a media archaeological veto insists. To what degree does the hardware of so-called born digital art matter? That is the moment when conservation specialists may ask for epistemological advice. It is the primary task of media theory to take philosophical care of technical terms like the emulation of early computational media artworks by contemporary operating systems. What seems evident on a practical level turns out to be a delicate challenge to the ethics of museum preservation. Media archaeology describes the techniques of cultural tradition and develops criteria for a philosophy of dealing with the temporalities, or how I call it, temporealities of technological agency. Any piece of media art is subject to time in its hardware embodiment, subject to physical entropy, but on the other hand, in its logical, almost time-invariant design, like circuit diagrams and software codes. Bernard Zerecht this morning said, they don't age. Code does not age. A circuit diagram does not age. So we have both physical entropy and informational negentropy. Any epistemology and aesthetics of media art preservation asks for the foundation of its argument in the technological ground, against all seductions of reducing preservation of media art to its sheer phenomenal appeal. So I'm, in a way, an anti-interfacial theorist of media art. There are different museological degrees for media art preservation. The conceptual, referring to design, the functional, referring to the electric circuitry, and the actual operative, time-critical reenactment. Because every time a piece of media art is put on show again, it's an act of reenactment. While in so-called performative historical reenactment, the theatrical drama aims at the effect of the original event. If people of nowadays reenact the Battle of Waterloo, this is a theatrical drama. It creates an effect. But media theatrical enactment aims at the functional reenactment in archival terms. In order to keep technologies from the past contemporary, it is not sufficient to simply display the device like a painting hanging at the museum wall or an ancient sculpture placed in the museum court. What constitutes the original in technological culture is not just its materiality, but its processual media existence. This either requires the provision of operational hardware from the technological past or a functional equivalent, which can be miraculously software of a second order. There is hardware from the past which can be reenacted as software. This is quite an ontological challenge. That is called the emulation of past hardware in a present operating system, such as the functional time-adequate simulation of the loading process of computer games from data set to Commodore 64 computer. Different from the notion of the historical original in cultural tradition, the material replica of media artifacts from the past allows for its authentic reenactment, even if the replica is not the original materiality anymore, but is principally replaced by a functional equivalent. I would say then it is still an original. That's a big difference to the traditional piece of art, which could not simply be copied. only when signal processing, only when a piece of art is, media art is signal processing, the media artistic object from the past becomes a source of knowledge. Museological media art preservation might therefore be metonymic, to take a term from rhetoric, in terms of cultural heritage. Metonymy means you name a part for the whole. And media art, taken as partial exemplification, as case study to ensure future insight into its technological ground, a testimony of a specific technocultural epoch. In terms of McLuhan's media theory, preserving artistic content should reveal its underlying technological message, which is the true potential historical significance of this piece of media art. So it's not the appearance, the feel, the look, but what is happening behind, within the black box. This is the true message to be preserved in future conservation. While in pre-electronic times, the tools of art making as cultural techniques like painting with brush and oil on canvas were public knowledge, more or less, contemporary media art encapsulates the hidden knowledge of electronics and algorithms. Now, to preserve this hidden knowledge and open it in the future, I see the main task in media art preservation. Since there are few other institutions to preserve such technological knowledge, art museums might take that additional chance to claim to transmit the memory of the media cultural age of today. So please take media art as exemplary of the way we are dealing with computational and electronic devices. And so the task of media art preservation is actually the task of how to preserve knowledge of our technological age as such. That's why I call it metonymic. It's much more than simply about the artwork, the media artwork. Preservation strategies for media art require at least two definitions. One of media and then of art. As expressed by the combinatorial term media art, there is no neologistic new term. We still call it media art. Different from traditional artworks, which have been directly resulting from the performative actions of human artists, media art unfolds primarily in its technological existence. It's much more technological than human, I would say. Different from reenactment of past events in artistic live performance, in criminal forensics, or in experimental archaeology, the reenactment of media art is by definition operative in the technological sense. It's not performative, it's operative. Instead of an idiosyncratic corporeal theatrical reenactment, technological experience of the past in the present is based on the reoperativity of the very machine or the technical or the technological or the code configuration itself. When in 2002, for example, Rod Dickinson reenacted at Glasgow the psychological experiment once conducted by Stanley Milgram in 1961, concentrating on the command of electric shocks for punishment to non-learning subjects in the next room, the reconstructed installation of this historic experiment could only be called media art if the aesthetic message depends on the electric action of a functionally equivalent apparatus with a voltage ranging from 15 to 450 volt. So the central piece had to be operationally, electronically functioning. Otherwise, the reenactment would just be theatrical and not be media art. The cries of pain by the victims in the original scenario were actually communicated from pre-recorded tape already in the original experiment in 1961. Such recorded presence can be time shifted without loss of authenticity. So we are suddenly dealing with a past which is not past or which is not historical past. Technologies are in being as media only in the moment of signal processing. And media art is defined by its time-based modality rather than space-based sculpture or painting. Already in photography, the exposure time has been co-defining the iconology of the image, a delta t, a delay, which increasingly shrinked almost to zero with instant photography. Technological media are experienced in performative ways from the human side, but in operative ways from within. Because not humans are the only ones looking at a piece of media art. Technology itself from the inside looks at it as well. In museum display of media art based such as sound and video installations, the physical objects on display are not to be regarded as aesthetics objects per se only. It is predominantly the process which is on exhibit. Whatever the aesthetic content may be, to be well documented by a contextual text, by the artist, or an interview with the artist creator himself, the true message of media art is its time base and its active chronopoetics. Therefore, an art museum necessarily turns into a media theater for reoperating techno-aesthetics, where the media are the main actors, the agency of the machine linked with a signal laboratory for reactivating data processing and with a library of audiovisual records or source code content, since any media operativity needs signal food to process. All such processes are grounded in actual media technology. Their material key elements, their techne, to say it in Old Greek, and essential in terms of governing principles, which would be the arche, the electric circuitry diagrams, source code of software. Against the curatorial veto, infrastructural cables and circuitry in electronic artworks, like the algorithms in digital works and the protocols of internet art, belong to the functional, but not ideal aesthetic enunciation, and therefore are allowed to be replaced for reenactment. The aesthetic content of media art asks to be displayed in action to be revealed. Otherwise, a medium like a video set is nothing but a piece of metal, glass, and rare earths. Traditional works of art are subject to time in the material sense. It is their physical entropy which requires curatorship and restoration. A painting endures in time, different from media art which unfolds in different time singularities. A technological object, in addition, is time-based in a conditional sense. Their media state only reveals when in operation, in signal processing. The core requirement for the preservation of media art, therefore, is technological reenactment, since its being only unfolds as time object. This message of media art, apart from the superficial audio or visual content, is temporal. Therefore, the focus of preservation is on actual reenactment or documentation of its former temporal action. That is the archival time diagram. That is the object to be preserved, the time diagram. Media epistemology contemplates the being in time of technological art, and its archaeology grounds in precise technological inspection. There is knowledge to be gained from technological hardware. The media archaeological approach requires in-depth knowledge of the associated technology. For inductive media archaeology, every piece of media art is idiosyncratically different. It deserves artifact, circuitry, and code-related answers and adaptive tactics rather than an overall strategy of preservation. A kind of technological historicism is required. The specific way of not simply representing, but representing media artistic works from the past requires regenerating and restoring its signal processing. This approach is decidedly materialist and anti-narrative and does not regard the social context. The conditions under which media art from the past can be said to have presence in the present are strictly technological. In 20th century, the familiar agency of the museum has been confronted with the challenge of electronic exhibits. In most museums of technology, for example, television sets of the late 1950s are usually exposed as dead objects, like any other material artifact. An electronic device that is not processing signals is not in its medium state, but just a piece of furniture. Most museum visitors actually look at old television and radio sets like a piece of antiquated design. They recognize the style and maybe become nostalgic about it, but do not attend to it as an operative medium. To exhibit an old television set or video, like a musical instrument from the past, in action is a challenge for museum conservators when, for example, a couple of condensers have to be exchanged for reactivating their signal processing. Then it is not the original anymore. And when the electronic image is unfolding again, should historical footage from the period of the television be shown or up-to-date content? In museums of industrial science and technology, one often sees steam engines actually running. But media art, which starts with electronic technology, and I would make a sharp cut here, it starts with electronic technology, is of a different kind. They are not primarily related to machines, to energy transformation, like industrial machines. What should be displayed in a museum if the object is electronic media? If the display is reduced to the surface or to the interface, then we miss their essence. But it is difficult for visitors to have a medium opened up and understand what is going on within. It is a big challenge to museum education and didactics to explain what is really happening there. A challenge to the design-oriented, surface-oriented display, which we find in most museums and art museums of media art. As a consequence, the imperative for museological preservation of digital media art is to lay bare the underlying algorithms in a kind of techno-anatomy. Like, and now we might show my only picture, like media artist Jan-Peter Sonntag conceptually opened an electronic analog synthesizer module. The technician, yes. Now, the German media theorist Friedrich Kittler, after he died, his papers came to the German Literary National Archive, but apart from papers, there are things like this. He had constructed his own analog modular synthesizer. Now, the traditional archivists didn't know what to do with these blocks, with these black boxes, the modules. And in a kind of media philology at Humboldt University, we were allowed to critically investigate his piece of electronic, which Friedrich Kittler had produced. And the media artist Jan-Peter Sonntag recorded and staged this analysis of a piece of electronics created by the media theorist Friedrich Kittler. Now, this is what Boris Greuß would call the submedial space behind the surface. Now, in order to critically ask questions about any product of media art, one has to open this black box. Different from immobile museum objects, time-based technology artifacts are in their media state only when being in dynamic operation. That's why the idea is to reoperate, to make it refunction this module again, that it produces a sound a modular piece of analog synthesizer, which is just kept in an archive, misses its heritage articulation. We have to hear it sound. Now that would mean active invasion in the electronic circuitry itself, which is a violence against the curatorial care, but it requires, because once more, the message of the medium is not in the materiality, but in its signal processing. In order to functionally reenact, for example, Dan Graham's video installation Present Continuous Pasts from 1974, the analog recorder tape delay may be emulated in digital signal processing. But the media artistic message, the irritation of presence to the then audience, can only be preserved in its specific materiality, which once triggered the idea of delayed presence, the reel-to-reel videotape and loop. Graham's installation has been a pure function of an electronic diagram, the feedback circuit, creating a re-entry within the actual present as effect of technically delayed videotape signal transduction. But in most books on the history of 20th century media art, we only see photographs of the gallery space where people look at monitors and look at the mirror and the video image. But we learn nothing about the technical precondition, the reel-to-reel tape, which by tape delay actually was the real message of the temporal irritation, which was the artistic message. Synchronizing signals are recorded on videotape itself, as you know, along with picture and sound information. This sync information enables the image to be played back in a stable fashion, oriented properly both vertically and horizontally. Changes in these synchronizing or timing signals causes time-based errors that result in disturbances of the images to be matched by the time-based corrector, the TBC. Video itself takes place not simply in cultural time, but is always already a technological time object itself, or even a time subject. Now I quote the phenomenologist Edmund Husserl, chronopoetically manipulated by artists. Video art master tape restoration means bringing it into playable condition again, which requires preservation of its signal processing state. This is technical restoration written with AU, restoring the post-Benjaminesque aura, restoration, by preserving its processual temporality, again written with AU. There is a temporal aura in media art which deserves priority. Such technical reproduction of electronic signals basically preserves its processional authenticity, even when resulting in linear distortions of the signal. A media artwork is copied when resting within the same format. Moving it into a different format, analog transfer or digital migration, means its transformation of substance. Now, this is a transubstantiation. That's a different issue. It has been not with photography or film, but with electronic image, with video art, that media art as category emerged. In 1965, Sony's Portapack enabled independent television art. Contemporary media art festivals, like the Berlin Transmediale or the Ars Electronica in Linz, actually started as video art festivals. So I would make, in the genealogy, when does media art start, make this cut, and let's start it with electronic art. Namjoon Paik's legendary exposition of music, electronic television, in the Wuppertal Galerie Parnasse in March 1963 allowed for the distortion of the live television image by magnetic modulation as what he then called participative television. Fluxus art emanated from the electromagnetic field. It's very physical. It's not metaphorical. Such performative media art requires co-originary reoperation rather than arbitrary reenactment of the electromagnetic effect on functionally equivalent machines. You cannot replace the electronic cathode ray tube of such an installation by a digital beamer. the electromagnetic field only works with a CRT in all its analog idiosyncrasies. A film documentation of this event would not tell anything about the conditions which made such appearances possible. Only the preservation of actual electronics allows for reenactment, whose a priori radically depends on the analog electronic tube. It does not work with pixel monitors. Since the electronic image, different from film, is rather dematerialized and rather transmission of a live signal than representation, the criterion for such media art preservation shifts from emphasis on materiality to emphasis on processuality. Materiality in electronic media does not refer just to hardware. The question that arises is whether, in addition to their value as aesthetic information, media art from the past has an external value linked to the original form of its artware, which is not sufficiently preserved after its transformation into a digital information carrier. It is not sufficient to migrate the artistic content without saving the original carrier, which would suggest that for an electronic video image or a musical tone, it is insignificant whether it is recorded on shellac disk, on compact disk, or computer file. Whereas for coded, that is, symbolically expressed art forms, like literature, the essential enunciation can be migrated via copying alphabetically. We can read a reprint of an old text and still keep the essential content. But different from that, the analog signal depends on its material implementation. Unless it becomes digitally sampled, then it becomes symbolical again, and thereby integrated into the symbolic order, which literally transubstantiates its essence. So let us sharply differentiate between the analog media art and the digital media art. The digital media art is the re-entry of the pre-analog printing culture on the level of code. That's an interesting turn which cannot be expressed in historical terms. The characteristic hiss and crackle of 78 records per minute press played by a steel needle was part of the listening experience of a gramophone record. So don't compress it in video digitized preservation. But McLuhan himself insisted, partly in accordance with the communication engineering model, that noise was part of the communication process, pointing at the hidden ground of the apparent technological figure. I take once more McLuhan. He separates between the aesthetic appearance, which he calls the figure, and he says, let's look at the ground, which enables this. What Shannon and Weaver in communication theory call noise, he called the medium, that is, all the side effects, all the unintended patterns and changes. All media tend to be subliminal in their structures. Media archaeology does not bury technological eventuality by contextualizing it in art historical narratives, but helps for media devices to let it speak themselves. Such enunciative media archaeology focuses on essential, knowledgeable, epistemogenic sections which normally escape human interface perception. A plea for material semantics without reductive materialism. The internal value of all electronic technology lies in its configuration and circuitry, in its interlacing of aesthetic appeal and material form of transmission. Digital signal processing, with which one can simulate analog sounds and images, up to and including interference, acoustic noise, and virtual reconstruction of the original performance space, is an example of the ambivalence between physical carrier and aesthetic content. Here, as in works of audiovisual media art, the performative, or better operative behavior of time-based media artworks becomes the decisive criterion in the analysis. The obvious materiality of electronic analog media enters the space of the calculating media by means of the simulation, for example, of a magnetic tape installation as a time event in a computer. The sampling theorem allows for the digital to recreate the analog signal to a certain degree. Now, this is an ontological challenge to digest this. Media-active archaeology is time-reversed, such as the restored wonders of original recordings from the dawn of television technology, made in the era could be recreated again by applying filtering algorithms of the present computer. So this is a temporal reversal. The computer algorithms themselves become the media archaeologists of previous media products. Materiality is still the blind spot in the information age and in electronic media. Digital media provide for materiality only by means of the maybe 3D printer, transforming the information of the object into its material replica. But a media artistic object has more information in it than a recording or scanning would ever provide. If the aura appeal of a work of art is rooted in its quality being here and now, as Walter Benjamin would express, it is dependent on its material presence, which is lost in the production and differs from the ephemeral presence of the electronic signal. Analog signal recording, like photographic, magnetophonic, and video image recordings, are subject to entropic aging. They degrade over time and quality with every copy they produce and in themselves. But once the signal has been digitized, it becomes timeless. Digital information, even if actual computing takes place in energy-absorbing, thereby temporarily irreversible machine systems, is conceptually suspended from physical time in information theory. The present as temporal denominator loses its plausibility with the binary information digit, with the bit. With digital preservation of analog media art heritage, the data file becomes a complete substitute of the original image relating to the visual content. This epistemological dilemma changes when it comes to born digital media art. The American Standard Code for Information Interchange, the ASCII code, has been based on the 7-bit structure, which in early days of computing was used for transmitting photos and graphics, as well as pixeling the visual information and translating it into the available 128 characters. Different art projects refer to this digital Stone Age, like the famous ASCII vision in the works of the ASCII art ensemble. The media archaeological approach to preservation of digital media art preserves the conditions of possibility, to use a term created by Immanuel Kant and then later taken up by François Lyotard, of such aesthetic expressions. Not primarily the surface experience, the aesthetic content, how we call it, which is figuratively exposed. The inherent quality of a technological work of art is not addressed to human senses only. In works of ASCII art, for example, the hidden media message, the ground in McLuhan's sense, is expressed by the work of art technologically itself. In early computing technology from 1947, the cathode ray tube was actually used as a storage device for a number of bits itself, thereby revealing the medium message on the interface level in an act of almost media artistic engineering. But the only audience to observe this display was meant to be the computer itself. Different from the previous technologies, now this is my final part, the computer as Turing machine is a theory-born medium. Still, a symbolical machine, in order to become operative in time, needs to be implemented in the physical world. That means in the time world. While its main quality is software, such code needs to be implemented in actual and active matter. Media archaeologically, this reminds of a legal fiction from the Renaissance, created in the Elizabethan England time to maintain the continuity of the state even in the interregnum between king's death and his successor's inauguration. The king has two bodies, his biological one, subject to aging and mortality, and his office body, which endures even when the throne is empty. The same is true for computational art. A museological gap opens between material preservation and functional reenactment, especially in preserving computer art. When a present computer emulates a previous Commodore 64 computer in order to run a vintage video game, it functionally is in the C64 present state. The concept of emulating another machine is essential for the very definition of the universal Turing machine. Once a mechanism has been transcribed into a discrete sequence of states, it can be initially inscribed onto the register that is the tape of the Turing machine. A universal Turing machine can emulate any other specific medium, including the Turing machine itself. The universal Turing machine, similar to the von Neumann model of our current computers, it follows that the universal Turing machine could emulate itself. That makes computer-generated art different from previous analog media artworks. At the same time, in the background, like the contemporary operating system is running. So we are in both a historical and a non-historical state when we reoperate computational art. The timing of the present system speeds the emulation up, but still can keep its authentic functionality. Now I think I have to come to end. So-called retrocomputing is so not a historical quotation, but a temporal representing itself. To sum up, because I think I'm running out of time, is that with digitally born computational media art, we are in a new situation which says you can preserve the original experience if you emulate a previous work by a later one. This is completely different to more materially embedded art or media art before. But then, to conclude, not only we have a strict break between traditional media art and computational media art with heavy consequences for the preservation strategy, but once things are digitized or digital, and be it a piece of art or non-art, then we have new options of getting knowledge about what is going on. We have clever algorithms which can reveal to us hidden knowledge within the digitized piece of art itself, even if the artist didn't know it. So research or experimental algorithms can give access to a media artistic knowledge once it's digitized, which opens new possibilities for museum research and museums display. And to sum up once more, the art museum or the museum of media art should not remain within the question of the art discussion, but proudly claim that the problems which we address are the problems of our technological culture as such. So in that context, the media art museums might become the avant-garde and one of the few places at all who actively take care about our technological heritage. And from that, the priority of the preservation strategy should be derived. That's my plea for you, colleagues. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much.